Hey y'all, we're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Manuel. So glad that you're here. Um, Sorry that we started you without any music. I had suggested that we play Kendrick Lamar's "Not Like Us" just to show who's really winning in that rap battle. Cause damn, that was smashing at the end. Um, but be that as it may, we're here for more serious things to talk about California's affordable housing crisis and what the role is of activism, of policymakers, and also funders in terms of trying to address that. I'd like to begin, however, like we began a lot of Zooms, if you could move the slide, to do a land acknowledgement and uh, acknowledge that, uh, for example, I'm in Southern California and that we here sit on the sacred land of the Tongva Nation. We also, when we acknowledge the land and its peoples, honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country and this state would not exist without the enslaved labor of Black people that was made free to those who used it. And indeed, when we start thinking about the hills that we have today, so many of them are rooted in stolen land and stolen labor. We share these acknowledgments to pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, to raise awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, to recognize our place in this history, but perhaps as important, to acknowledge that this history is living. It is living in the problems that plague so many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. It's living in the legacy of redlining and the contemporary history of disinvestment and neglect in Black communities and other communities of color. So this is not simply an acknowledgement of the past, but a recognition of the present and a promise for the future to do better collectively by all of us. So please take a moment to feel the ground under your feet and to honor the land. What you see on the slide is a website I bet many of you are familiar with, nativeland.ca, which is an interactive website where you can look at whose land you currently sit and live in, and to think about how this moment of taking time to acknowledge this can be substantive, not performative. What does it look like to repair the past? What does it look like to shift our future? So, uh, with that said, but not forgotten, please let's move to the next slide. Again, I'm Manuel Bastard. I'm director of the Equity Research Institute. Probably most important, like many of you, I'm a friend of Paulina Gonzalez-Brito, and that means when she asked me to moderate, I could not say no. I really had no choice. So there are a few rules here. Uh, Please stay muted throughout the briefing unless you're asked to unmute to, for example, ask a question. If you could take a moment to make the chat active by introducing yourself with your name, organization, the region you work in. Uh, the presentations will be recorded. The question and answer session will not be recorded. And please submit your questions in the chat for the Q&A. These questions will surface to me and then I'll bring them forward. I was asked to set the stage for what we're trying to do with this session. And essentially, I think so often when people think about the homelessness crisis and the housing crisis, that at least some group of people blame it on the individuals experiencing houselessness, talk about it as their fault, talk about it in terms of addiction, mental illness, and things that are real that impact our communities. Others speak about it as a governmental issue. What should the government be doing better? And we acknowledge the important role for government in providing services, providing leadership, providing policy change. But what we want to lift up today is corporate accountability as part of the problem and part of the solution. That is when landlords, real estate developers are allowed to operate in a way that does not promote low income and affordable housing. Uh, this helps to create the pressures that lead to homelessness and the crisis we're facing. And it makes sense to understand the roots of the tools that we have to induce better corporate behavior. Too often we think it's about service provision to those experiencing the problem or lobbying the government. But what is now called RISE Economy, previously the California Reinvestment Coalition, has a lot of experience utilizing the Community Reinvestment Act passed in 1977, which essentially gave community organizations tools when banks were seeking mergers to be able to say that if you were to get bigger or to merge, that you had to make sure you were not abandoning low income clients, that you are not in continuing to engage in redlining in terms of credit, that you needed to be a better corporate actor. And this is a key part of our organizing history. So it's not just services, it's not just pushing the government, it's about thinking about the corporate role and insisting on corporate accountability. Now, we know that that can't happen alone, that if we want to address the capital gap in terms of the investments we need in more affordable housing, uh, better lending to communities of color and low income communities so that they can secure their own assets in the form of home ownership, business startups, and the like, that we need to engage in policy change. And that in turn requires the sort of transformational organizing that can strengthen community voice to hold service providers accountable, to hold government accountable, and certainly to hold corporate actors accountable. So we're trying to weave together many different things together. And luckily for us, we have a great set of speakers. Next slide. First, a word. We want to thank our sponsors of this event, California Community Foundation, the California Endowment, Common Council Foundation, San Francisco Foundation, Funders to End Homelessness, the Inland Empire Funders Alliance, Philanthropy California, just spent a wonderful day with them in Sacramento, and Smart Growth California, all of whom have been thinking about this relationship between service provision, government accountability, and corporate accountability. And we have a great set of speakers. That's the next slide. To address this, one who unfortunately will not be with us today, but is still great, Isaac Bryant, California Assembly member from District 55, who got called away on an emergency session, hopefully to deal with exactly this issue. And so instead, we'll be starting with my good friend Jarrett Barrios from the California Community Foundation. We'll be turning from there to Paulina Gonzalez-Brito, there to my dear friend, who I'll get a chance to introduce, Holly Mitchell, then Hasten Ndiaye, who's the Executive Director of Northern California Land Trust, and then Leo Goldberg, California Community Land Trust, all great speakers, all weaving a story before we get to question and answer. But let me start con mi compañero de siempre, el otro cubano en este movimiento, my good friend, Jarrett Barrios.
Muchas gracias, caballero. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jarrett Barrios with the California Community Foundation, and I want to build on the conversation that Manuel started around corporate accountability and specifically talk about credit granting institutions, most notably banks, but also mortgage companies, and what we can do legislatively, the policy matter, to create that accountability and through that create opportunity for our communities. The most important sort of statute in this space that I am going to focus on builds on the Federal Community Reinvestment Act. And the point we're getting to is, why the heck doesn't California have a state community reinvestment act like most other progressive states? Because it's impacting communities and we could do better. But I'm going to start with a little bit of background. Most of you probably know that the civil rights laws connected to housing, the first major one was passed with the Fair Housing Act in 1968. But a Fair Housing Act without access to credit doesn't necessarily mean very much, which is why in 74, Congress passed and Nixon signed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. That was thought to maybe remedy things, but of course, unless you track it, what is measured gets done, right? And they weren't tracking it. About 2 years later, in 76, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act was passed. That was for the first time tracking it. It only tracked residential mortgages were tracked, but they tracked access to credit to those mortgages based on race. So for the first time, we could assess, and it was very sobering information, who was getting credit and who wasn't. That was the inspiration, finally, in 77, for the Community Reinvestment Act, which was a federal act which reviews banks and credit unions, examines them based on a few things. It looks at their lending history, who they're lending to, again, with that Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. It also looks at kind of what they're doing to service communities. Where are they putting their branches? And what kind of services they're offering, and in particular focused on underserved communities. And then finally, it's looking at where they're investing, who they're giving their money to invest in community development projects, where they're giving their grant dollars to, other things that they're doing to plow back into communities most in need. So that affects a lot of the affordable housing developments that are going on in our communities, because that's a principal place where they can access affordable credit. All of this is tied up in the Community Reinvestment Act. What's not often realized, though, is that the Community Reinvestment Act at the federal level only applies to federally chartered banks. So at the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, or at the Federal Reserve, the different banks are chartered with these institutions are subject. But if you're a state chartered bank, you are not subject to any of these affirmative investment, affirmative lending requirements. That's why many other states have a Community Reinvestment Act. This is, I think I was asked in part to join here because in my earlier career, when I was a state senator in Massachusetts, we amended our Community Reinvestment Act to expand it. Massachusetts became the first state to extend from beyond banks and credit unions to include mortgage companies. At the time, this was in 2007, 2008, there had been a big evolution since the passage of the CRA. When CRA was originally passed, banks were the primary originator of most mortgages, most residential mortgage loans, as well as most other sorts of credit. Mortgage companies had since come to occupy now about 75 to 80% of mortgages are originated through mortgage companies. So CRA wasn't covering them, and we wanted to make sure they were covered. Again, all of this was around ensuring that communities in need of credit had access to affordable credit. People were competing for their dollars, just like others would be in wealthier communities. The road to passing that, to include mortgage companies and amending that CRA bill, was a long one. It took about 8 years. And that's because in essence, it's not easy to get people. People understand housing. The credit systems that support housing are a little more complex and a lot of time not thought of as sexy. And building a coalition of support took many years in that regard. Right now, folks at Rise Economy are doing the same to try to build coalitions of support to do a community investment act here in California. Not surprisingly, it's slow going. They're in year one. It took us 7, 8 years in Massachusetts with a lot of power building, a lot of investment from philanthropy to support that coalition. There's a lot of interesting partners. At first, when we did it, we had opposition from the banks, from the realtors. The mortgage brokers weren't as organized, and community didn't necessarily understand the importance of this in wealth creation in communities of color and lower income communities. But over time, with a lot of education and investments in coalition building, we were able to get there. And I think that's sort of how I want to tee this up for Paulina, because Paulina is going to be talking about it. And I think we're going to hear about a little bit more some of these efforts in California to support expanding that access in part through a Community Investment Act. But I do want to finish by noting that there are impacts, positive impacts to community for the Community Investment Act, because federal banks that do business in California are already covered. The Umpqua and Columbia Bank merger, I know, Rise, you guys were very involved in that. You were able to get ELAC, a lot of resources to do an affordable housing development. That's just one example. But community banks that tend to be chartered at the state level are not currently covered. And we would love to have them have the same affirmative credit lending obligations and service obligations that federally chartered banks do. So we really would love to see a state CRA, one that is broad, that is inclusive, like Illinois, New York's, Massachusetts, and that can hopefully have the same impact that the federal CRA examinations do when there are mergers, when there are new branches created. All of these are opportunities to really enforce the requirements of CRA, because whenever a bank wants to merge with another one, whenever there's a new branch, you have the opportunity to go back and look at what those examinations have revealed. What credit, what score did they get? What grade did they get from the CRA examiners? So it matters when those things happen. And we can, I think, give more obligations. If we could have the same thing happening at the state level, we can really extend more credit to community. So with that, I get to introduce, I think, Paulina Gonzalez-Brito. Paulina, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Jarrett. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paulina Gonzalez-Brito. I'm the CEO of Rise Economy. And I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon to talk about how we can help the state of California's affordable housing crisis through bold policy solutions, specifically policy solutions that force corporate accountability and corporate solutions to bolster public sector efforts. Next slide. Before I get into talking about policy, I just want to give you a little bit of information on Rise Economy. We're building a powerful movement here for economic justice, focused on knocking down the historical barriers for Black, Latinx, and other people of color who have faced hardships building generational wealth. I want to underscore the words powerful movement. We have over 300 community-based organizations as members across the state. They represent tens of thousands of low-income and BIPOC Californians. And we use the power of advocacy to advance systems change, to drive community-serving investment to our communities to close the racial wealth gap. I invite all of you to get to know us a little better by visiting our website. We're also, we will be issuing our annual report in the next few days, and happy to share that with anybody who's interested. Next slide. So here at Rise Economy, we are reversing generations of exclusion that has resulted from the legacy of redlining in this country. Our communities have long been denied not only opportunities to build generational wealth, but also denied investment that addresses community needs. So I'll be talking a bit about how we leverage the Federal Community Reinvestment Act so that banks are part of the solution to the affordable housing crisis. Next slide. So here at Rise Economy, we leverage the Federal Community Reinvestment Act and the obligation it places on financial institutions to affirmatively meet the needs of low-income communities, including support for affordable housing. In this way, we bring some of the most powerful actors in the world, banks, to the table with communities, where communities have the power they need to negotiate strong commitments. These are frontline groups at the table going toe-to-toe with financial institutions. In 2023, we had 156 people representing 118 organizations engaged in our various bank campaigns. And over the last 5 years, we have negotiated $112 billion in community benefit agreements for California, securing commitments from banks to support affordable housing efforts, home ownership for BIPOC people, support for small businesses, and more. This is a list of some of the community benefits agreements we've been able to win. From some of the smallest banks in the state, Central Valley Community Bank, when it merged with Community West Bank, in a really important part of the state in the Central Valley, which has long been disinvested. We were able to win a $1.17 billion community benefit agreement. And on top of that, we were able to get the bank to commit to divest from fossil fuels. That's the first time in the country that a bank has committed to do that. To some of the larger banks in the state, BMO, Bank of the West, $16 billion for California communities, and US Bank, Union Bank, $60 billion for California communities. Next slide. So what does this mean for affordable housing preservation and creation? Through these community benefit agreements, we have secured real wins for affordable housing. These agreements include over $60 million for community land trust, and you'll be hearing from some of our partners in the community land trust movement here shortly. $10 billion for rental affordable housing preservation and creation, and $276 million in grants and contributions for community initiatives, including housing counseling and homelessness prevention. Next slide. So the affordable housing commitments that I just mentioned translate into affordable housing units. Here's an example of units built in the Bay Area and Central California through Merit Capital, a nonprofit housing intermediary, funded by our community benefits agreements with BMO Harris, Umpqua, and First Citizens. A total of 500 units from this example alone, supporting some of the affordable housing developers in the state like Eden Housing, Pacific Companies, and Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation. Next slide. So Jarrett talked a bit about the opportunities of a state Community Reinvestment Act, and we have that opportunity here in California. Not all financial institutions are covered by the federal CRA. The financial landscape has changed tremendously. Jarrett talked a bit about non-bank mortgage lenders and the role they're playing in the financial industry. But some financial institutions don't have an affirmative obligation to invest in affordable housing or community needs. They're excluded completely from the federal CRA. We believe the time is now in California for corporate accountability and policy solutions. We have an opportunity to join 9 other states who have state community reinvestment acts and learn from what they have done, including New York, Washington, Massachusetts, West Virginia, and others. And community organizations throughout the state who are part of our membership and other partner organizations are organizing for a California CRA and LLC ownership transparency. I'll be talking about both these policies in the next few minutes. It will be a long road to victory. You also heard from Jarrett, it took him 8 years in Massachusetts, but we believe the wins will be worth it. These policies will generate significant revenue streams and data for community-centered reinvestment through corporate accountability. Next slide. So who would a California State Community Reinvestment Act cover? So it would extend this affirmative obligation to meet community needs to the following entities. So first of all, state chartered banks. They are subject to the Federal Community Reinvestment Act and are already doing some reinvestment, but a state CRA bill would provide more pointed guidance and incentives for these banks to support programs that generate affordable housing, such as funding for community land trust and shared equity models. Next, credit unions. They've always been excluded by the federal CRA, and they benefit from nonprofit tax-exempt status, and recent information has shed light on their impact on communities. The Department of Financial Protection and Innovation found credit unions made up 15 of the top 20 highest fee charging institutions. These are fees like overdraft fees and non-sufficient fund fees that hurt low-income Californians the most. And redlining is not only an issue with banks, but also with credit unions. For example, Black applicants for home loans to Navy Federal Credit Union were more than twice as likely to be denied as white applicants. So we would want to cover credit unions. Next is non-bank mortgage lenders. You all have probably heard of Rocket Mortgage. That's who we're talking about. These are non-banks making mortgage loans, and they make about 75% of home loans in California. We have some real concerns with non-bank mortgage lenders. They tend to make more FHA loans, which are more expensive than conventional loans. And we are worried, there's some evidence that they're steering customers into more expensive FHA loans, even when they would qualify for a conventional mortgage. And even more concerning, recent studies have found that people of color are paying more for home loans originated by non-bank mortgage lenders than white borrowers. And finally, we would want to cover deposit holding fintech firms. This would be the first time in the country that these companies would be covered by a state CRA. So we're talking about entities like Cash App and Venmo. They store funds similar to bank deposits, yet they have no reinvestment obligation or not covered by the federal CRA. Next slide. So what would it mean to have these institutions have an affirmative obligation to meet the financial service needs of low-income communities and communities of color? How will they be evaluated? So first of all, in California, the policy and development would be more explicit and directive about what covered financial institutions should be doing. These activities would be written into the statute itself, and covered financial institutions would be evaluated on whether they're making investments in things like affordable housing creation and preservation, community land trusts, the green economy investments, and climate resiliency investments. Second, financial institutions would be downgraded in these evaluations for any harm they're doing. So we're finding, for instance, that financial institutions are making mortgages to these large investors that are turning around and evicting tenants systematically. So if that's something that's happening, there would be a downgrade for harm. If they're engaging in discrimination or consumer protection violations, or they're financing fossil fuels, there would be downgrades for harm. This is something that doesn't exist currently with the federal CRA, and we want to make sure it's captured at the state level. We want to include an evaluation on whether these financial institutions are meeting the needs of communities of color. The federal CRA only evaluates institutions on whether they're meeting the needs of low-income communities. So we want to extend that to communities of color. We want to incentivize community benefit agreements, just like those that I talked about earlier, to ensure that banks are engaging with communities and really centering community need when they're moving forward in mergers or other acquisitions. We want there to be consequences for poor performance. No mergers, no new branches, a license could be in question. State deposits would not be housed in any institutions that are doing poorly, and there would be financial penalties. Lastly, we want to establish a housing trust fund, which will receive funds from covered financial institutions to foster the development and preservation of affordable housing. Next, please. So what would be the resulting investments in California from such a law? Our analysis shows that a state CRA in California would generate $21.5 billion per year for lending and investment, including mortgage lending for BIPOC borrowers and communities, small business lending and philanthropy, and $8 billion a year for community development lending and investment, half of which typically goes to housing. This is things like low-income housing tax credits, community land trust support for low-income housing developers and developers of color. Next slide. So I want to shift away for a moment from talking about capital to talk about holding large investors accountable that are buying up housing in our communities, and they are often aggressive evictors, which exacerbates the homelessness crisis. Next slide. So we are currently running a bill, SB 1201, the LLC Owner Transparency Act, authored by Senator Marilena Durazo. Currently, LLCs are owners of housing, but they're undisclosed. The owners are undisclosed in the basic paperwork filed with the California Secretary of State. So LLCs create these layers of anonymity that shield serial evictors from any kinds of tenant protection laws. So SB 1201 would require the human owners behind the LLCs to be named on paperwork with the California Secretary of State. So this bill would do a number of things. Often cities, counties, and legal service providers can't enforce rent control or fight evictions in court because the owner of the property is shielded and just lists another LLC as an owner, making it so that nobody can be held accountable. SB 1201 would create transparency so that cities, counties, and legal service providers can enforce rent control and take on aggressive evictors and address habitability code violations causing chronic illnesses, housing decay, and draining government resources. This law would really help code enforcement identify a pattern of bad actors and develop a systemic approach for repeat offenders. Next slide. This is an example of the ways in which large investors hide behind a web of LLCs to shield themselves from laws meant to protect tenants. It's a little hard to see, but on the right side at the top, you see Middle Management LLC, and it lists M&M Asset Management LLC as the owner, shielding Swami, the true owner of these properties, from any accountability for wrongful evictions or rent increases. Next slide. Ultimately, solving the affordable housing crisis necessitates policy solutions that result in corporate accountability. Government can't do it alone. I want to end with what it'll take to win. Ultimately, it will take your support. We need support from philanthropy to make a long-term commitment to these fights. The result can mean billions for affordable housing. So what it will take to win: organizing and power building to support long-term policy fights for corporate and investor accountability. It will take a communication strategy to shift the narrative on homelessness and the housing crisis to include corporate and investor accountability. It will take research to better track the impact and tell the story of community benefits agreements. And we need to build the capacity of community-based organizations across the state with training and technical assistance to negotiate directly with banks in their communities. Next slide. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time this afternoon that you're spending with us. Here's my contact information if you have any questions, and I'll turn it back to Manuel. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina, and thank you so much for being exactly on time. That was moderately incredible. No academic would have been able to do that. So it gives me great pleasure, and I asked to be able to do this, to introduce, it's a secret, my favorite policymaker, Supervisor Holly Mitchell, who I think can bring both a state perspective from her former role in the Assembly, and of course, what the county can do. And I also want to thank Holly, because I know just a week or two ago, you gave a talk at the social work program at USC, and my daughter introduced herself as my daughter, and you even remembered who I was. And that raised my stock with my family quite a bit. So thank you very much. Let's turn things over to my friend, Holly Mitchell.
Well, the truth of the matter is he's being coy. I told him years ago that I have two policy crushes. He's one, and then Reverend Barber. So fortunately for you, Professor, I didn't tell her I could have been your mama. I didn't go there. So I kept it PG. And I know you're very proud. It was an engaging conversation, and she leaned in and asked tough questions. I would expect nothing less. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to have the conversation. I want to thank you, Paulina. And, you know, where Paulina ended, let me just say this before I get into my prepared remarks, and I'm not going to talk long like electeds can, worse than academics. But I want to say that, you know, Paulina, I think the other next step is making sure that elected leaders like myself don't get complacent. Complacent's the wrong word. Don't get distracted by the current condition of our budgets, that we don't get distracted by the upcoming November election cycle. It is going to be important that we keep our foot on the accelerator if we are going to continue this important movement toward housing production, towards housing preservation, towards tenant protections. We can't allow ourselves to be distracted by budget deficits. We've been there before, and we just can't be distracted. So I hope that you all will join me in that, echoing that perspective to my fellow electeds. I appreciate being here. You know, LA County's 10 million people. I have the privilege of representing 2 million of them in the 2nd district, which is incredibly diverse. It spans from Hermosa Beach to Compton, Culver City to Carson. It's diverse in geography, people, and experiences, all of whom have a common desire, a high quality of life, safety, and housing that they can afford, and housing that's desirable and appropriate for them and their families. And I have to say, housing and houselessness is the top issue that I get asked about, that my staff gets asked about literally on a daily basis. And I do mean 7 days a week, around the clock. And I get it. I understand why. The projections of new housing needed across LA County, you all know this number, I'm sure, is in the neighborhood of 800,000, 500,000 of which is needed to be affordable. We also have about 500,000 people who are housing insecure and at, you know, with a very high probability of losing their home. It's a razor thin margin. So I also get asked about how to fix the crisis, and what I really get asked about is what people like to do to elected officials, is point the finger at me. What are you gonna do about it? And so I thought you know, while I'm flattered that people think that I have the power, now LA County Board of Supervisors, that we are a group of badasses. It's a powerful entity. I am flattered to think people believe that I have the solution all by myself. That is not the case. I do not have a magic wand, and I cannot create a new landmass. If I could, I would. This is a decades in the making problem. And the truth of the matter is, we all have to lean in and put our shoulder to the grindstone. So, you know, when I think about the housing crisis, you know, there are a couple of main characters in this story, government and developers. But there's a third character in the story, and that's finance, investors, and philanthropy. In government, we provide the rules for the physical development, and each level has a role in that, each level of government. Here in LA County, our regional planning department is aggressively updating our land use and zoning to meet our current housing element. And I'm proud to say that the county's area plans focus on the intersection of environmental justice, housing, and economic opportunity. You know, I have been saying for years, when I tried to wrap my head around as a policymaker, you know, how we got here and what do we do to get out of it. I'm clear that, you know, the housing conversation we've got to answer 3 questions. What do we build? For whom? And where? And when my constituents come up and ask me and opine about what we should do about it, you know, it's those 3 questions that I think all of us have a responsibility to think deeply and think honestly about, and figure out how we move. So with the land use and zoning updated at the county and reviews and approval streamlined, I think developers will be in a better position to advance their developments. If they have that third character magic ingredient, which is the capital. They need the money to build. And just as developers need certainty from government for reviews and approval, they need certainty in financing as well. I recently heard from a market rate developer that self-imposes affordability on their housing sites, which I appreciate, that the change in interest rate, get this, moved their monthly loan payment from $30,000 a month to $90,000 a month. It tripled based on the most recent interest rate increase. And I don't think this example is unique. My team are here regularly for mission-driven affordable housing developers about the challenges in accessing capital and the cost of capital as well. And these are the organizations creating new below market rate housing. In LA County, as a result of the advocacy of housing organizations, we have annually $100 million for the Affordable Housing Program, also known as the Housing Trust Fund. The LA County Affordable Housing Program provides a local funding source to leverage other public and private funding. So to give you a sense of the impact of these funds, in my district alone, just this calendar year, 573 new affordable housing units will become home to approximately 800 people because developers leveraged public dollars. LA County's Affordable Housing Program supports affordable housing primarily with the low-income housing tax credit model. And now with our brand new regional entity, the Los Angeles County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, also known as LACASA, our region has the opportunity to further diversify housing investments. I'm proud to be the chair of the inaugural year of LACASA, and what we're doing is bringing together the county, all 5 of us serve, big cities, smaller cities, non-elected experts, developers, to have an ongoing regional funding for diverse strategies on protection, preservation, and production. You heard me say that before. Those are our 3 guiding P's, if you will. Protection of tenants, preservation of our existing affordable housing stock, and the big P, production we're going to build. LACASA's focus is the capacity and capital to support all 88 cities in fulfilling visions for their respective housing needs. Ownership, renovation, preventing existing house residents from falling into homelessness, youth, seniors, veterans, former foster youth. We're focusing on all of those populations because we need it all. And we can get there with public funds, leveraging private financing. In November, LA County voters will decide on a new funding initiative for housing and homelessness services. This citizens initiative, if passed, will provide an ongoing public funding for housing. I understand that the signatures were submitted to the registrar of voters just this week, so I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. Government is updating our rules to increase and streamline, to streamline our rules and regulations. And voters, hopefully, will continue to step up this November, and we need corporate and really all the non-government funders to also join us and update funding and finance rules to align with this current momentum we're all seeing and experiencing. Again, the challenge is too extreme, it's too big. It's going to take all of us to ensure that we have dignified housing that everyone can afford. Thank you so much, Manuel. I appreciate the opportunity to present. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for helping folks understand the different levels of activity and action that's going on, and for spending time with us. People really appreciate that. And we know, I believe that you have to jump off right now, but we'll make sure that questions come after you later, if there are some.
Fair enough. Thank you all.
So we're now going to turn to one of the things that many of us are looking to as part of a solution, community land trusts. And we have 2 speakers from the Northern California Community Land Trust and from the California Community Land Trust. We'll be speaking a little bit about that as a tool and a strategy, but also much more broadly about corporate accountability to be able to support community land trusts and community ownership. We're going to start with Ndiaye, who is the Executive Director of the Northern California Community Land Trust. Hasan.
Hi, y'all, and good early afternoon. I'm Ndiaye, as Manuel just said, Executive Director of the Northern California Land Trust. NCLT is a land trust based in Berkeley, California, but we work throughout the Bay Area. We're a land trust that incubates and nurtures permanently affordable communities. NCLT uses community ownership and control of land in order to provide affordable homes and community facilities in the long term. We're the oldest land trust in the Bay Area. We're also one of the largest in the Bay Area, but also one of the largest in the state. Our focus ever since I basically took over as executive director, but also in more recent years, has been on advancing racial equity and housing justice, climate readiness, and building the infrastructure for community ownership through technical assistance and incubation services. We kind of tend to be known as one of the organizations you kind of call, I mean, along with, of course, CACLTN, when you're just thinking to yourself, if you've been organizing or working with the community, and you're thinking to yourself, like, so I want to start a land trust, we tend to be one of the first or second calls that you get. As a CLT, and I don't want to speak for every CLT across the state, but just from the experience of being a CLT and working with other CLT as an incubator and as a technical assistance provider, we face a series of suboptimal choices. We have a mission and responsibility to provide rent-restricted, affordable housing. We also, as a mission, try to create opportunities for home ownership and wealth building and thinking about the long-term stewardship of properties and land. We are also committed to taking properties and units off the speculative market. And then finally, we're also committed to reinvesting in our portfolio and making sure that our properties are properties that we can be proud of. To that end, we've been somewhat successful in being able to make significant investments in our existing portfolio. We've grown about fourfold in the last 5 years, but that's also meant running into a lot of different issues with financing. We've been really lucky to work with great city and community and private partners, but we've run into significant issues with our lending partners. This is common for a lot of organizations that work in community ownership. As everybody who is a provider, and he is actually a practitioner in affordable housing, we're aware of the fact that because of our mission-oriented goals, we understand that for lending partners, our restrictions can create potential issues. I want to talk a little bit sort of like how this kind of plays out in actuality. One is we are a lot more successful at being able to gain acquisition costs than we are at long-term stewardship costs. And so this is reinvestment, rehabbing costs, because we also understand that because of the cost of doing rehabilitation these days, there are limited amounts of potential equity available within our properties for us to be actually be able to really invest in that property. We're also seeing very, very limited support for some of our more equity-centered initiatives. We're currently working on building a new affordable housing home ownership project in South Berkeley. Our goal is to be able to leverage the preference policy that was recently passed and implemented in the city of Berkeley, but we're running into a lot of issues around financing, especially for what are likely to be low-income African-American and Latino homeowners, and their ability to actually qualify for capital to be able to move into units that are going to be ownership co-ops or ownership condos as part of our land trust project. And then finally, when we're thinking about how we can interrupt the process of displacement, really interrupt the process of folks who are living in investor-owned properties, and those properties are either going in foreclosure or changing hands very rapidly. How are land trusts part of the solution to interrupt that process that might lead to an eviction and potentially lead to homelessness? And we've been successful in the past in being one of the organizations that were able to actually purchase a house under SB 1409 and help keep a resident housed over in Contra Costa County. But we essentially had to build that plane as we were flying it, with working with a really great lending partner who was able to step in, really shorten the red tape and make this deal happen in an incredibly short amount of time, allowing us to actually move at the speed of the market. But that was a one-time thing. And the question is, how do we create those lending products to be flexible and responsive to actual community needs? Lastly, I really want to talk about how having detailed CBAs that actually include community land trusts as a focus for funding can help us basically be able to have that flexible, innovative capital that's actually going to allow us to be able to make deals happen. One of the biggest things that we're running into is the upfront principal and interest costs create too much of a burden on our operating sheet that makes it a little bit more difficult for us to be able to make the kind of changes and improvements that are actually going to make this property a lot better, look a lot better as an investment opportunity. And so we're really interested in what could come out of some of the reforms around the CRA and what would come out of a California CRA. And with that, I will pass it to Leo.
Thank you, Asen, and great to be with everyone. Thanks for having me today. I've been asked to encourage everyone to put some questions in the chat. Hopefully I'll give you some puzzling information that'll elicit a bunch of questions, but we are about to go into a Q&A in just a few minutes. So please pop questions in the chat. I'm co-director for policy and capacity building with the California Community Land Trust Network. So unlike Asen, who sits at a particular place-based community development organization, my seat is at a network organization. We lead capacity building for community land trusts and coordinate policy advocacy. So I'm going to kind of give you a perspective from that, that kind of umbrella position. I will say I have a few slides, if I can cue those up. That's possible. But if it's not, that's fine as well. All right, here we go. And we can go to the second one. So today we have 40 community land trusts across the state. I think you got a feel from Asen. These are community-based nonprofits that steward permanently affordable, community-controlled housing and land. They center BIPOC and low-income communities and seek to create an alternative to displacement and gentrification. We have a number of established community land trusts, including Northern California Land Trust that you just heard about. But we have, and these are the green dots on the map, we have an increasing number of emerging groups. And these are particularly emerging in parts of the state that have traditionally been more affordable, but in recent years are experiencing the homelessness and housing affordability crisis that has been on the coast for a while. So I'm talking about the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, far Northern California. Folks are really concerned by, the inability to buy homes, inability to meet these rising rents, and are looking at community ownership and the CLT model as a strategy going forward. And if we go to the next slide, just to give you an idea of who lives in community land trust housing across the state, 60% of CLT residents make less than $40,000 a year. That's per household, so relatively low incomes. And 80% of CLT residents identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color. And our next slide, I have a few pictures to kind of give you some visuals of what does a CLT project look like. There isn't necessarily a typical one. We really have a range. Community Land Trust center their work on affordable housing affordable for low and moderate income folks. But there's increasingly other types of projects in response to community needs. So on the upper left there, you see urban farm. We have single family homes. We have mixed use facilities. We have multifamily, rental, and ownership properties common across the state. And these need financing, and these CLTs need funding. And that's actually my last slide if you want to kill the slides. So for the most part, tax credit financing does not work for CLT projects, right? Many of you will know tax credits are, maybe the most common form of financing for affordable housing development in the state. Neither does many forms of public subsidy, both local, state, and national public subsidy. And that's because, first of all, CLTs use these long-term renewable ground leases that can be a complicating factor for public subsidy. And many community land trusts, including NCLT, have a goal around ownership that can mean converting rental buildings into home ownership opportunities for their residents over time. And most funding sources don't allow for that, don't provide that kind of flexibility. So that means there's a substantial need for financing in addition to operating supports that Asen spoke to. So we need financing that works with renewable ground leases. We need financing that works with shared equity home ownership, in which a lower income family is able to buy way below market prices, build some equity, and when they sell, they're going to resell at a price that's affordable to another low or moderate income family. And in many cases, we need financing that can close really quickly. And this is true of the example that Asen was talking about. In many cases, CLTs are being approached by tenants who are facing displacement. There's a property that's on the market. So the CLT is competing with market actors. They can't sit around in a conversation with a bank for a year. They need financing that's able to close in weeks or maybe a couple months. And that's a major need on the acquisition fund. And then finally, our CLTs need operational supports. They're not just affordable housing developers, they are ownership partners with these buildings, and they provide long-term stewardship, which doesn't pay for itself. So we strongly feel that banks and other financial institutions have an obligation to contribute to this financing picture that I've described. We have had the opportunity to work with Rise Economy over the last few years on getting language into these community benefits agreements that directs banks who were entering into bank mergers to make investments into community land trusts, into affordable housing preservation, which is the most common form of CLT projects. And we, as Paulina noted, we've gotten millions of dollars of commitments in 5 different CBAs in just the last 3 years, with Rise Economy leading the charge on those negotiations and CLT groups from across the state involved. So that's really exciting. And we've learned a few things in the process. So one thing we've learned is that a big win in a CBA is just the beginning of a process rather than the end, right? And we were able to get a really substantial commitment from Silicon Valley Bank a couple of years ago, only for them to get thrown into turmoil what felt like a couple months later. We went through the ups and downs of continuing to negotiate for CLT commitments with the successor bank. But that's just to say that getting the commitment itself in the CBA is just the beginning. And we've also learned that banks will be more than happy to make a commitment in community benefits agreement and then forget about it, right? So we really have to continue to hold them accountable and keep them at the table. And I'm pleased to report that on the first of these CBA agreements that explicitly called out community land trusts, we have been doing that. So we've been talking to a bank and educating them about the work of community land trusts and other community developers around the state. And they've recently made 2 grants to CLTs, one in Northern California, one in Southern California. And I think I'm hoping that we'll be hearing about more soon. They're a direct result of the community benefits agreement that they entered into a couple of years ago. I'm hoping that this will be a catalyst for more funding and financing out this bank, but also from the others that entered into CBAs. And that this will also be a test case for what the power of a state CRA could be. Because the state CRA, as has been noted, wouldn't just apply to state chartered banks, but a much broader range of financial institutions and be able to pull in this really massive new funding source for community development generally and the kind of community-owned development that CLTs do. So we could imagine we're going to be able to design this thing. So we could imagine that a bank would get more CRA credit under the state CRA if they are committing funds to shared equity ownership or to permanently affordable housing or to community land trusts or whatever we decide are the top priorities for community investment. And that might be a little different than the kind of current affordable housing financing system, right? Which has its own set of baked in priorities. Finally, I'll just say this is especially important given that we're facing state budget cuts in the affordable housing field right now, and there's deficits at the state level anticipated for a number of years, and clearly waiting on the federal government to make the massive investments in community development that everyone knows we need the federal government to make. Waiting on them is not going to get us anywhere. So looking at holding these financial actors accountable and making that a resource for community development, I think is going to be really important. So with that, I will hand it back to Professor Pastor.
Thank you, Leo and Hasten. And I feel like my kids, after a long day of school, we used to say, my brain is full. That was a lot of information from many different perspectives. So I want to look back with a couple of questions that have popped up. And the first one, if it's okay, is going to Jarrett. And in part, Jarrett, you've got this unique experience of having been a policy maker, a policy advocate, and a funder. And I'm wondering, in this current circumstance, with this set of initiatives, particularly state CRA and related legislation that Rise Economy is talking about, and with this maturing community land trust movement and set of institutions, what can funders do? How can they be helpful without being too prescriptive and really follow what's going on and be supportive?
Thanks, Manuel. I think it's a great question, and I want to start the answer by reminding folks of what Paulina said, which is that this effort, CRA and the associated efforts, are going to take time, right? And it takes time because you're essentially you're doing power building work. Paulina, I think you mentioned you had about 300 organizations that are part of the coalition. That doesn't mean that all 300 organizations are going to come out of the gate tomorrow and know, but if there's funding associated with building the power for those organizations, supporting their efforts, supporting Rise Economy's efforts, to do the research, which mobilizes folks, to support the organizations in the time that they need to spend to engage their community groups, and who will then engage elected officials. That's where you get the sort of community level engagement over 2 to 3 or 4 years, right? That will get this on the agenda. I think we're at a propitious moment. I think that, and the supervisor mentioned, right? There are certain silver linings to bad budget years. I think most people are like, oh God, a bad budget year. Everything sucks. Well, yes, and people, particularly policymakers who are entrepreneurial, right, recognizing they're not going to get that line item in the budget, they can look to non-budget efforts to make a difference in systems change. And this is one of those efforts, right? There's a minimal cost associated with establishing a set of examiners at the state level. And there's huge benefit back from the private sector. So it is, I think, from philanthropy's perspective, where a lot of our systems change efforts that are legislative in nature, but that have a dollar sign attached, those might be less attractive in the next couple of years. Whereas this, I think, rises in attractiveness because it isn't something with a big price tag next to it. Those are a couple of thoughts I had, Manuel. Paulina, I don't know if you want to add to that since you're a lot closer to this effort.
Thanks, Jarrett. Yeah, I think power building is exactly what we're talking about here, and really bringing to the forefront groups on the ground doing the work every day who see the impact of disinvestment in their communities to be able to tell that story, to tell the story of disinvestment and the potential of reinvestment, and really shifting the narrative to one of corporate accountability. I think the public sector efforts are so important, but they're just not enough. And so if we can shift the narrative to talk about corporate accountability, to really educate folks about the history of redlining, the fact that these banks purposefully did not land in communities of color and Black communities in particular, and what that has led to in terms of housing segregation, disinvestment, displacement of residents, and all the resulting impacts of redlining. Being able to tell that story and then to shift to telling the story of reversing those impacts and really holding banks accountable for the history that they've engaged in to be able to now ensure that they're meeting the needs of communities of color first and foremost. So thank you.
I want to follow up for the two of you because two things come to my mind when you're talking. First, Jarrett, is that you're asking that foundations consider not just investing in infrastructure, but in interstructure. That is the coalition building and the web of relationships. And quite often, that stuff is poorly funded, but absolutely critical to not power building in a silo, but actually power building for a movement. So you might have a comment on that. The other thing, which probably both of you have a comment on, is it strikes me that the historic work of Rise Economy, and it's a little bit like labor unions, is a space where community-based organizations learn, and I think this happens in the community land trust space as well, learn to contest with capital and collaborate with capital. That is to contest around investments and accountability, and then to work together when you can on implementation, on putting together complex funding for projects. And that skill of combining contestation and collaboration is probably the way out of a lot of our dilemmas. Let me start with Paulina. Does that infrastructure piece and that how do you fight with and then work with corporate actors? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and we've had both experiences. We've had the experience of having to engage in campaigns to convince a financial institution to come to the table when they were reluctant to do so or outright hostile to doing so. And we've also had banks who, from the get-go, want to do the right thing. They want to come to the table and engage with communities and put together a community benefit package that really builds on what they've historically done in communities. And I think I am proud to say that in both of those instances, once the community benefits are signed, once they're submitted to the regulators, once communities have been at the table engaging with banks, that relationship is getting built to be able to then implement. And it's not always, when we think about power building and movement building, as Leo said, there's the campaign piece of it to get these banks to the table, but the implementation piece, keeping that power going, to be able to ensure that these banks hold up their commitments, that they're accountable to them, and that they meet them is just as important. So, whether we win legislation or whether we're engaging with a bank in a campaign, the work doesn't stop there. And we have to be able to hold these banks accountable to the commitments they make. It can't just be a piece of paper that sits on a shelf somewhere gathering dust. It has to be a living document. And I think those relationships that we build with financial institutions, sometimes contested, sometimes, smoother, are ultimately, what's going to create the real impact on the ground.
Yeah, that's really important. It's not governing power is not just a protest march, but actually also making sure something gets implemented. Jarrett, did you want to say anything on infrastructure? I saw you moving your hands a lot.
I loved it.
That might just be because you're Cuban and cubanos no se puede hablar sin manos. But
So I wanted to say, in addition to the interstructure between our nonprofit, right, networks, the power building networks, there's some very interesting politics with the financial institutions. And let me give you a couple of quick examples. I'm not sure if anybody on the call worked on tobacco issues earlier, but there was an interesting dynamic back in the day when we were passing no smoking ordinances, where the restaurants would oppose it at the city level, and then it gets passed, and then they become super supportive of passing it at the state level to create sort of a network where there's where everybody's treated equally, right? The other cities don't have the ability to have smokers where you don't. There's a similar dynamic here, particularly with the banks, right? Most banks are currently covered by the CRA. There are some that aren't. But that, if you think about it, that gives your credit unions and your mortgage companies sort of an unfair market advantage over the banks at the state level in some of these ways, right? Like they don't have the same affirmative lending obligations, which in the case of Massachusetts, when we were passing this, that was the primary reason. It took about 3 years, but we were able to get the State Bankers Association on board in support of this, where you get the Bankers Association on support of a financial regulation. That makes it much easier, right, to engage moderates on something that, frankly, everybody should be supportive of, but which people might be suspicious of because we come at it from the left. So I responded to what you said because I feel like that there's sort of maybe not your typical bedfellows, right? But because of the nature of this, there are opportunities for coalition building for that infrastructure, right? Which are not just the usual suspects in nonprofit land, but also some private sector partners.
Great. I want to turn to Asen and Leo. There are a lot of questions and curiosities about community land trusts. Do they exist in San Diego? Was one, but also some really interesting questions, some of which you addressed about the complexities of financing, but specifically also about mixed use development, because I think in a lot of our neighborhoods that so many of us work in, live in, are concerned about, the community fabric is housing, but it's also whether or not local people of color-owned businesses that meet the real demands of people in the neighborhood have a place to be. So can you talk just a little bit about even more the complexities of financing and how mixed use or sort of retail business development might fit in?
Asen, I can kick it off and then you can drill down, or we can go the other way.
I mean, I can go ahead and at least address the commercial space issue, but go ahead and start us off.
Well, I'll say, that there's a number of the financing challenges that are shared with other community developers. It's not like the CLT model necessarily throws up all these issues that have to be problem solved. And we do have the community land trusts across the country. There's older community land trusts in other parts of the country who have been successful in working with major banks on getting mortgage financing for CLT homeowners and financing for multifamily projects and mixed use projects. Those same banks often won't lend in California because their officers here are unfamiliar with the model and want to do the easy, safe thing. So, there's nothing about the model that necessarily has to be a problem for financing. And I can go into more detail on the mixed use front. I'll just say that we have community land trusts across the state who are, working on these preservation projects where tenants reach out. There are commercial units on the ground floor, sometimes long-time community serving kind of legacy businesses. And all of a sudden the CLT that just did housing has commercial spaces, or it has social service spaces, has a community garden. So this is a really big issue. I'm glad you're shining a light on it. And it's one of the places where, in particular, a lot of public subsidy programs, which are really focused on housing, are not helpful. And where there's a big opportunity to bring in our financial institutions to play a bigger role. But Asen, it would be great to hear, in particular with NCLT.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, this is something that we're facing right now. I'm in one of the commercial spaces that we own. We own a commercial property at 3120 Shattuck. I'll take my background off here so you can at least see what it generally looks like. And it's actually going to be one of our great, I think, really great projects. This is where we really want to do our first ground up construction project. It's going to be on the site of this commercial property. But we're also committed to replacing every square inch of the commercial space in the new construction building. We've been able to identify a lot of sources, both in subsidy and in financing for the housing portion of our project. But our retail space, and we're again committed because one of our tenants we've had for 40 years, another tenant we've had for over 15 years, and we're really committed to continuing to be an affordable commercial space here in South Berkeley. But finding the financing for that portion of the project is turning out to be possibly like one of the most difficult ways for us to be able to try to close this deal. And so thinking about how land trusts are thinking about acquiring properties in the future, that I think there's one big thing for them to think about it, whether or not it adds complexity to the deal, and also kind of the thinking about what the actual economics of your commercial space are, and whether or not you can actually make that commercial space affordable over the long term. One of the other things I think I'd say is we want nothing more. That's the great thing about land trust, is that our focus really is on how do you leverage the affordable value of land to be able to meet community needs. And those community needs could be housing, those community needs could be gardens, could be public, recreational spaces. It could be commercial spaces, so you can go ahead and keep that culture in your neighborhood. And so if our main focus is really thinking about how do we use the mechanism, the tool, really we're trying to figure out how do we find financing partners to be able to help us meet that community need, whatever that looks like.
Thank you all very much. I'm gonna sort of hand things back to Paulina for any final words, and then I'll close us out. We're gonna try to end this about 5 minutes early, because what I've found is that if you give people a bathroom break before their next Zoom, they remember you with tremendous kindness. And that's the kind of attitude we want. So Paulina, there was a question for you about how you maintain community voice and community accountability and community benefits agreements. But I was just hoping you sort of summarize what you really want to say to the people, particularly the funders who are part of this informational Zoom.
Yeah, thanks, Manuel. I think just about that in terms of community voice. So I mentioned we have 300 or over 300 organizations across the state that are part of our membership. And so these range from tenant organizations to community land trusts, affordable housing developers, legal service providers, a whole range of organizations that are working in communities. And we really think about them as frontline groups. They're the ones doing the hard work on the ground, day in and day out, and have their ear to the ground on what community needs are. And so we really provide the space for those groups to come to the table. And for instance, any community benefit proposal that we make to a financial institution is informed by those groups and by what they're telling us the needs are on the ground are. It really is important to remember that these groups represent, tens of thousands of people in California. And it's those stories and those needs that get lifted up first and foremost. And I think one of the things that when we think about, how funders can support, it's really uplifting those stories of those communities in terms of what their needs are, what's lacking, who's engaging in practices that harm those communities, telling the story of investors, telling the story of redlining, but doing it from community voice and from those groups on the ground doing that work every day. And so we hope you'll help us in telling those stories and lifting up those voices as we engage and move forward on this policy making. Thanks, Manuel.
Well, we want to thank everybody who was part of the session today. Certainly want to thank our amazing speakers and friends who showed up. We also want to make sure to thank the sponsors of this event. Once again, California Community Foundation, California Endowment, Common Council Foundation, San Francisco Foundation, Funders Together to End Homelessness, Inland Empire Funders Alliance, Philanthropy California, and Smart Growth California. And perhaps to end where we began, we acknowledged the land we sit in and on. We acknowledged the labor that's been stolen to build an economy that many enjoy. And we also acknowledged the continuing challenges of exclusion and discrimination that plague our financial systems, our economic systems, and our systems of political voice. Today has been a moment to educate ourselves about how this plays out in the arenas of housing and homelessness, how to think about, yes, the role of service providers, yes, the role of government, but also the role of corporate accountability and how it is that funders can help leverage their resources to promote the power building and organizing that can make corporate accountability real and make the promise of economic inclusion actualized in our California economy. And with that, we'll give you back a little bit of time and just remind you, Kendrick won. Kendrick won. Bye-bye, y'all.